Sometimes, people encounter something in their lives that truly resonates with them. Something that stays with them, and maybe even starts to shape them. For me, that something is Final Fantasy. But what makes these games so special? In the hopes of answering that question, I created this video series to take an in-depth look at each of Final Fantasy's numbered installments. I'm the Thief of Crystals, and this is the magic of Final Fantasy. When you consider what sort of a game the sequel to the very first Final Fantasy should be, it's fairly possible you'd land on something that resembles Final Fantasy III, which builds upon the established character classes to forge the foundations of the now familiar job system, all while introducing several other formative elements that would come to define the series. But this video isn't about that game. It's about Final Fantasy II, which took the approach of doing a lot of things differently to provide its own contributions to the series. It's actually fascinating how much this game differs from its previous entry. So let's take a closer look at the first game ever faced with the task of telling a new chapter in the Final Fantasy series. Right off the bat, Final Fantasy II takes a significant departure from the first game, given that, rather than being purely about the adventure, it places something more of a focus on establishing its characters and story. Instead of creating your own party, you play as a group of orphans seeking to fight against the Empire that invaded and destroyed their home. The Empire only continues to run rampant, leaving death and despair in their wake, and after being separated from their friend Leon, the trio of Firion, Maria, and Guy choose to fight against the Empire alongside Princess Hilda and the Wild Rose Rebellion. Thus begins their quest to defeat the villainous Emperor, David Bowie. This game is where we can see certain beginnings of the formula familiar in later games starting to take hold, such as the character-driven narrative, such as it is, that we see gain more of a distinct presence in Final Fantasy IV and V, and then really hit its stride in Final Fantasy VI. Despite being properly defined in IV, Dragoons make their first appearance here, as do Chocobos. There's also the premise of a corrupt empire waging war being a big favourite of the series, and we even get to meet Cid for the first time, who's predictably the given airship provider of the game. Another returning concept is that of acquiring new party members as your story progresses, which happens rather frequently over the course of the game. Final Fantasy II allows you to have a party of 3 characters, Firion, Maria, and Guy, plus a 4th interchangeable guest character who you cycle between across the course of the game. While these cycling characters remove what could have been a consistent 4-person party, I actually found it interesting seeing new party members pop up and wondering who would help me next. What sort of character would they be? How would they fight? I actually found myself growing sort of attached to some of them, like Gordon, look at his little poses. Also Leela, because she's a badass pirate and is basically a prototype Faris. I remember enjoying Final Fantasy II a decent bit when I was younger, because the early stages of the game seemed to go quite a bit easier on you than Final Fantasy I does. And since I was a dumb kid who was bad at every game I played, I found this pretty agreeable. However, while this is the case for the earlier portion of the game, getting further in made me understand that this isn't exactly the case. Fighting monsters and leveling up isn't always enough to get by in Final Fantasy II. In fact, the game doesn't even make use of character levels or classes. Instead, you specifically level up the things you use in combat. Attacking with a sword will start leveling your sword proficiency, attacking with spears will level those, and so on. This is a decent attempt at mixing up the traditional formula that unfortunately comes with some glaring issues. For example, casting magic only levels the spell specifically being used instead of leveling black magic or white magic as a whole, meaning you're in for an absolutely hellish grind if you want to keep your spells evenly leveled. Something like proficiency with a specific weapon works well in something like the Elder Scrolls, where said levels bolster the stats provided by an existing overall character level, and progress with each individual swing in real-time battles. Not so much in a game where individual stats are leveled independently and are progressed via turn-based combat. The game also likes to make use of enemies that can potentially decimate you if they land a single attack, meaning you specifically need to level evasion to avoid this. Evasion is leveled as a result of characters being targeted, which leads to some players just sitting in fights with 2 shields or even hitting themselves constantly in order to speed up the grind, which is about as hilarious as it is abysmal. Fortunately, this is less imperative in the Pixel Remaster, which seems to allow you to grind less overall in order to complete the game. This was the version I played, and honestly, I want to take a moment to give my thoughts on the idea of the remasters in general. As someone who prefers the classic pixel-based aesthetic of the 2D titles, while enjoying the updated features of prior remasters, this feels like a great compromise that results in the best of both worlds. I'm honestly surprised the pixel remasters haven't been promoted more. Between the entirely redone visuals and the brand new soundtracks provided to each, there's a great deal of passion put into them that practically makes them new experiences even for returning fans. In my opinion at least, this is the definitive way to experience not only Final Fantasy II, but every Final Fantasy being given a pixel remaster. At the time of writing this, the first 5 games have been released, with the 6th on the way, and I'm especially excited to play that one, along with Final Fantasy IV. I'd recommend them to any other fans looking to jump into the earlier games. Given that I do endeavour to at least avoid turning a blind eye to any notable flaws of these games, granted that seems to contradict the very title of this series, but if you love something, you gotta be willing to accept its shortcomings. It is worth mentioning that some of these fights get absolutely wacky. Like, look at this! This is not okay! Especially towards the end of the game, the balance of some of these fights seems to dissolve faster than my parents' marriage, and I cannot begin to imagine how grueling the final dungeon was back in the days before modern adjustments and quick save. SNES gamers really do be built different. Also, the encounter rate feels really high, which seems to just be a thing with the 2D titles, and the keyword system, while interesting to me at first glance, doesn't strictly add anything to the formula and can be somewhat cryptic at times. Unfortunately, this game does still suffer from some of the puzzling vagueness of its predecessor, and while I'd say it's not quite as egregious here, it is certainly a thing. Now, onto a more positive note, this game honestly grew on me the more I played it. For the first third or so of the game, I was struggling to stay invested because, frankly, the early 2D titles don't typically have a whole lot going on in the story department. Firion and the party are all blank slate characters outside of Guy speaking Beaver, and they don't really display any sort of character traits or development over the course of the adventure. Granted, you should probably have an idea what you're getting into with the early RPGs like this, which weren't exactly known for their narratives, but the later stages of the game sort of surprised me. There's no grand storytelling or anything like that, but there's fun little morsels of scenarios and events that served to keep me interested in what was coming next. It actually felt reminiscent of stuff you might expect to see in a simplistic D&D campaign. On that note, I mentioned the comparisons to D&D in my video about FF1, and maybe 5 as well, but I think that comparison actually deserved a bit more of a focus. I don't actually know that Final Fantasy would exist, at least in its current form, without Dungeons & Dragons. There's a lot of clear inspiration in the monster design, and the early games especially feel akin to a classic tabletop fantasy adventure. Final Fantasy II specifically features some hallmark tropes. A princess aiding the party, beating up pirates, riding a dragon into a tornado, hell yeah! Several different characters showing up to help the party as though a bored DM is cycling through different flavor of the month NPCs, dungeons that you find yourself getting lost in, like seriously, where do I go? Ancient legends, forbidden spells, and an evil emperor who in a bid for world domination unleashes an army of monsters to sow chaos and discord. Speaking of Discord, yeah, I gotcha! There's now an official Thief of Crystal's Discord server. It has channels for things like memes, and you'll be notified immediately whenever I start streaming or upload a new video. So if you want to stay in the loop and keep up with a complete fucking loser like me, you can do that. This is a thing that you can now do if you click that link in the description. Frankly, you're this far into the video, you're basically legally required to come join at this point. Anyway, it's worth mentioning that in my opinion at least, Final Fantasy II has some promising story elements that could really shine if they were given the chance to be fleshed out further. I actually see a lot of potential in the events and setting of this game. After doing a touch of research, I learned about the novel written for the game, which actually introduces some elements I find really interesting while building upon the foundations of the game's story. A good example is that in the original game, Emperor Matius is kind of a nothing villain. He's effectively just there to be evil and little else. The novel fleshes out his origins by revealing that Palamecia is cursed with demonic influences that corrupt its emperors. The demon corrupting Matius originated from the beginning of the world itself and seeks revenge for being sealed away in the indestructible Stone of Eludia. The Emperor's mother, originally intended to appear in the game, is exiled to the desert, where she spends her life trying to find a way to save him. How cool does that sound? Suddenly we have a villain with a bit more depth and intrigue to him. I really wish that this sort of stuff could have made it into the final game, or at least a remastered version. While I'd say that Final Fantasy II is a game that requires more patience than most, there is of course value to be found here. Several elements are utilized or referenced in later titles, notably Final Fantasy IX, and perhaps its most notable difference from its predecessor, pre-made characters and a greater focus on plot, set the course for every game to come and could be the initial reason we even have the beautifully in-depth stories we do now. It retains the charm present in the first game while following a different direction, one that might have left the series looking very different had it been absent. A surprising amount is owed to the experimental nature following games would inherit from the very first sequel in the Final Fantasy series, and that's something I think all fans can be grateful for. Following up a game like Final Fantasy I is a monumental challenge, and I personally believe Final Fantasy II met that challenge with something new, creative, and unlike anything before it. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe, drop a like, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. You can join my Discord for updates and to hang out with the lovely members of the Thieves Guild. I can also be followed on Twitter, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon, or simply donate directly via PayPal. Links can be found in the description below. Have a great day. I'll catch you next time.